Mr. Case, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, all. Coming to you from Hawaii, where it's very early but no snow, so I'll take the sunrise over the snow. And along those lines, Mr. Kramer, I have, of course, a major military presence here in Hawaii. I've got well over 100,000 military service members and family members here, 17,000 plus privatized housing units across all services. And so I've had a little bit of a microcosm of this in the last couple of years, although not as severe as the rest of the country. So in that context, you know, we're talking here about privatized housing and some of the processes for getting to complaints. And privatized housing issues are, of course, about quality of life, but they're about health also. I mean, that at the very basic level, they're about the health of the folks living in those units, and that's where the most troubling reports have been from lead-based paint or mold infestation, et cetera. There were inventories charged to the services in the 2019-2020 time frame where basically DoD asked all of the services to go out there and actually inventory their units. This is a little bit of my subjective impression, but those were in some cases inconsistent in terms of which services did how broadly they inventoried, how broadly they reached out to their members. And nonetheless, the reports back gave a pretty clear picture of where some of the major issues were and where the follow-up needed to occur. And so my question is there now a regular process? And I'm not so much talking about the annual inventory of how the tenants feel. I'm talking about the services going in and following up with inspections of the units. So that you're not relying on, necessarily on what the tenants say, although that's an important thing to rely on, but you're not also relying on what the private companies say is or isn't the issue, but you are actually independently verifying whether some of these significant potential health concerns are in fact concerns, and if so, requiring the companies to replace them as opposed to kind of leaving it to the company's judgment. Where is that independent oversight on the actual health concerns arising out of the operation of the privatized housing program?
Congressman, that's you were spot on. Yeah. So the summer of 2019, the Secretary of Defense and directed all the service secretaries and their senior leaders to go out and inspect all homes, and so that was done. Those actions then turned into immediate work orders to correct the deficiencies that are found, and then all the military departments then turned, instead of that one-time inspection, they turned it into a series of inspections. One of the Army in this case probably led the effort, was that we overwhelmed the new tenants at sign-in. So we give them a book and said, here's your house, here's where everything we found wrong. If you see anything, come back and tell us. In a lot of cases, that would never turn into actionable items. And so each one of the military departments now will go in at a 30-day after lease signing. That was an NDA clause, and so it's not a sign your lease and then call me if you have issues. And so it's now the military departments are proactive in going out to the houses to say, all right, knock on the door, do you have any issues, and they'll get those tracked in. The other thing that we've done is implemented an annual inspection requirement. And so you have a face-to-face. Some families may not let you in the house, but we're going and knocking on doors and saying, hey, it's been a year since we last talked. Maybe you've done work orders, maybe you haven't. And then you have that dialogue between the military housing office, the government side, and the residents to have that dialogue back and say, are there issues with your housing or not? So in the cases we have now increased the dialogue and making that a routine part of the process of living in family housing. Because we have some residents that don't PCS very often, and they're in their 5-6 years, and they may not have called in any work orders. So the problems in the houses don't become really known until there's a catastrophic event. So we're trying to prevent that through the ongoing dialogue that occurs with the families. Over.
Thank you very much. I'll defer further questions as my time's up.
I know we're bouncing around a little bit, but I don't believe Ms. Lee has any additional questions. So we'll go to Mr. Case. And thank you for your questions, Mr. Gonzalez.
Thank you. Mr. Kramer, back to the actual health conditions of the service members and their families in our privatized housing. I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, I recall that the FY21 NDAA, the one we just passed, requires a DoD Inspector General to provide a report on conditions of health conditions of residents in privatized housing within 90 days. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And do you know what the status of that is? I mean, 90 days is coming up in about 5 or 6 weeks.
So within the military, within the Department of Defense, they're in what we would refer to as the data collection phase, and getting organized, and then they will then go out and do individual site visits, if you will, just to validate the data that's being collected. Over.
Related, but possibly independently. Have you actually seen, do you have data to indicate that there are any trends in terms of actual health conditions arising from, the residents of privatized housing? Is it going down, the number of complaints or even demonstrated connections in the last, say, 4 years or so since this just really started to hit the fan?
So we've not had the opportunity to see trends, and for the most part, there's been a number of initiatives that have taken place in the last couple of years. The Army had started a health registry database, if you will, where it was open to all current residents, former residents to register in the database. So if they had health conditions, they can make those health conditions known. When they signed up in the register, they were also then linked up if there were ongoing issues with health professionals to go forward. That register has been in place for about 18 months, and there's a little over 500 families that have signed up. With the other database that is ongoing is tracking displaced residents. And so if you have a home, in a lot of cases, mold is just because there's water intrusion, moisture that's not being taken care of through an HVAC. And then once you get to the point where a family does become sick or have an allergic reaction to the mold, then they're displaced. And so I would say that, probably 18 months ago, it spiked in the displacements, and those are coming back down. So consistent, we've not been able to see any linkage that comes back that we can honestly say a house is causing a number of disturbances within a family, or a project in and of itself is through a lack of maintenance or lack of proper care is a pinpoint to a health issues within families. And we're still collecting data, which is what all these other initiatives are designed to do, see if we can come up with some systemic cause and effect, if you will, to the privatized housing. Over.
Okay, and let me just switch for a second here. We've talked a lot about tenant bill of rights and how some of the companies, if I understand your testimony correctly, have declined to adopt the voluntary tenant bill of rights, or actually the tenant bill of rights, I suppose, is technically, legally, at least in their view, voluntary. It begs the question to me of whether there has been adequate accountability for the private companies over the course of this situation where these are obviously long-term leases. They're paid a certain amount. They are allowed to adjust their income for conditions. I expect in terms of what they charge through the basic allowance for housing, the BOH. I guess my concern is, have you taken a look at the question of whether they should actually be able to charge through everything? Or have they absorbed some financial consequences for perceived deficiencies in the administration of some of the privatized housing over the last couple of years, or is it just a straight pass-through where they're kind of getting a free ride?
So I can say that all of the project owners have absorbed a loss, and it's not a pass through. And so their fees, if you will, are based on revenue. And so residents vote with their feet. And so occupancy, while it's still over 90%, it is down a couple of percentage points across the board. But the property managers, which is really where a lot of these issues had surfaced, and they may or may not exist to the extent today. Their fees are pinned to the property management incentive fee programs that were put into place for the military departments over the last year and a half, and then really empowered the uniformed military to grade the property management performance, if you will, as far as work orders, satisfaction, work order performance, the quality of the work, and then those are all fed back into the incentive fees. And most of the incentive fees prior to 2019 had not been looked at since the project was closed, and some of them were, quite frankly, 15, 16 years old. Not that they turned into, kind of a boilerplate, but they were not measuring the things that were most important to the residents 2 years ago when this whole housing crisis came about. So now the property management incentive fees, which is owned by the military departments, then gets back into grading the performance of the property managers where past fees weren't. And so instead of kind of a payout in the 80, 90% range, some of the payouts now were down 50, 60% range. And so they all are impacted by their performance. So if they're not providing the standard performance that is expected by the military departments, they are then graded accordingly on the incentive fees. Over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Case. I have about 18 seconds. Mr. Case, your hand is raised. Then I'll have one more question, and then we'll wrap up. Mr. Case?
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Kramer, I was going to make that comment at the end of your last answer, which was that although I understand your point on the service members having alternatives and how that impacts fees paid to the private operators in many parts of the country, and Hawaii is example number one. As a practical matter, they cannot live elsewhere because of the high cost of living, the low availability of housing, especially in the enlisted ranks. And so privatized housing becomes really a captive market from the perspective of the private companies. So I would just leave that with you, and as you consider how we can properly financially incentivize the companies to do the right thing here consistently. And I don't want to bash all companies because, the companies have been largely, I think, responsive in many, many areas, but there are gaps that we definitely need to still get at. Ms. Field, here's the big picture question. What questions do you wish we had asked you, and can you please answer them?
Oh my goodness. Well, and I guess I would identify two questions. One is, what can we do now to address the problem of some privatized housing projects being disproportionately hurt by the reduction in the basic allowance for housing? And the answer to that is that Congress needs to pass legislation that changes how the payments back to the companies to offset the effects of those reductions are calculated, so that the two calculations are consistent. If we don't have that happen, then we're going to continue to have some privatized housing projects, especially those in lower cost areas, disproportionately hurt by those reductions in the basic allowance for housing. The second thing I would I guess have been interested in discussing is, what can the privatized housing projects do related to climate resilience? So we have seen privatized housing projects impacted by severe weather events, hurricanes, wind and hail storms. And the department, I think, really needs to keep an eye on ensuring that the privatized housing projects are prepared for what's to come down the road. Their GAO, as you know, has identified the government's fiscal exposure due to climate change as a high-risk area. And so I think that would be an interesting area to explore moving forward. Thank you for that opportunity.
Okay, I think that
So, Mr. Case,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that was yeah. So I want to make sure that, I want to clarify my remarks. And so while our numbers show that 2/3, 66 to 70% of the residents are in the junior enlisted. So I take your comment, to heart, because they do not. The junior enlisted don't have the purchasing power that the senior folks have, and so I just want to make sure that for the record, prior to 2019, we thought in the department that the service members would vote with their feet and say, look, I'm going to go elsewhere. And we now know, when we did the analysis of who actually is renting on post, it's the junior enlisted. So that's why we really in the department have ratcheted up our oversight and are really taking this really to heart. And to the other part of that is Ms. Field's right, is so climate climate change and weather does have a catastrophic effect on project companies in the form of insurance payments. And so all of these extreme weather events, and they're not just on the coast anymore, they're across the country, do then play into the project company's ability to provide services on their respective locations. Over.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer, and completely understood. I think we're both on the same page as to the practical realities facing our service members across the country in terms of getting housing, especially on the enlisted side. So thanks for that confirmation. I would just leave you with the thought that, as Ms. Field said, I think the big picture lesson here is how can we come up with a different incentive system in these public-private partnerships that doesn't lead us to the result where, at least in some cases, some companies are disincentivized to keep military housing up to the proper standards and not properly incentivized to do it as a financial profit motive from their perspective. And I think that's the big picture question with that Ms. Field referred to. I don't have any further questions, Madam Chair. Thanks to both of you for a very good hearing.